You know, sometimes the messages that I need to deliver are a little bit more heavy than other times, and today is one of them. Last Sunday is the day on the calendar known as National Sanctity of Human Life Day. And it was established by President Ronald Reagan back in 1984. And it was no coincidence that he chose the actual day on the calendar that was the anniversary of the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion, January 22nd. And that legal ruling by the court will reach its 50th anniversary next year. And as I see it, it will be no golden commemoration. Abortion is, as we all know, is a very divisive issue. And the debates that can be heard these days will always be passionately defended, one side or the other. But rarely will you have people actually debating on the issue of when life begins. Because in some people's minds, it's an issue that's been settled, and so we don't need to go there. Whereas, as I see it, it is the issue regarding abortion. And I am convinced that most people, especially those in abortion, have made their decision on that particular subject without ever having considered all of the facts on that particular topic. But I also sense that that is true to a somewhat lesser extent within the believing community. While we will all be able to express our convictions, and some of us can cite relevant verses from the Bible, many believers can strengthen their testimony by having a more focused understanding on the issue of how life begins, so that you will be prepared to engage in the conversations that may arise. And this is especially important in a day when we are starting to see advocates of abortion within the church community, attempting to use the Bible to justify their position. So it seems to me that those of us who name Yeshua as Lord ought to be able to articulate accurately what the Bible actually reveals regarding the beginning of life, and to address the fallacy of those who use the Bible to justify abortion. Now, all civilized people will agree that murdering human beings is a crime that deserves punishment of some sort. The degree to which, okay, that's another debatable topic. But the point is that there is sort of a universal agreement against murder of human beings. But see, the ultimate question then becomes, are the unborn human beings? Or to put it another way, if the fetus is a person, abortion is murder. But if not, abortion is just a mere medical procedure. So how then do you base your decision? What is the criteria that you use to determine when life begins, and therefore to determine whether the taking of the life in the womb is murder or a medical procedure? Some people say that life begins when a fetus becomes viable, meaning able to survive outside of the womb, which is generally agreed to be around the mark of 24 weeks of pregnancy, give or take a little bit. In fact, that number has shifted a bit lower over time because of advancements in medicine. But this 24-week mark, based on the principle of viability, is the basis of the Roe versus Wade decision. And as a result, many of the abortion laws or the rights to abortion that have been enacted in states are based on that principle, the 24-week mark. Up until that point in time, abortion is often legal in many states. Some variance on that numbers. But as I see it, viability outside of the womb is a rather arbitrary standard, because even the newborn baby cannot survive on its own after birth. He or she is still dependent on others to survive, most notably the mother. And I believe that the viability standard is accepted by proponents of abortion so that there will be less resistance to the practice. It's kind of like, well, if you know you're going to get an abortion, you will have that decision made by the 24-week mark. And so they'll kind of sacrifice the right to the rest. So what it does is it suppresses resistance to abortion in totality. Calling viability the moment when someone becomes a human being is completely arbitrary and disregards the process of development both before and after that particular moment. It's a continuity that we see. Some people say that life begins when there is a fetal heartbeat, and that is the basis for the law in 6 states, most recently Texas, which prohibits abortion after a heartbeat can be detected by ultrasound. Typically, that occurs by the 6-week mark, although science has proven that the cells that are the precursors to the heart will actually start pulsing at 3 weeks. 21 days, these cells just start pulsing. And so again, is it because you can detect it that makes it life? But before that, it is not. Again, you can see the arbitrary nature to that. But on the other hand, you can see the motivation for that because then it suppresses the number of abortions that can occur. Now, when it comes to religious traditions, there is likewise no consensus. In a poll that was conducted by the Pew Research Group, which is a very highly respected, highly accurate polling service, it determined what percentage of all religious groups approve of abortion. You know what the number one group is? It's Judaism. 83% of all Jews responding to that poll agreed that abortion should be legal. Well, I believe that there are 2 reasons for this perspective. I, as one, never want to just take numbers on their face value. I want to know why people believe in that way. And I believe that not many people have actually dug into it to see just exactly where this comes from. One is that there is a long-standing interpretation in Judaism about how life begins. And this informs the way that abortion is viewed today. Here's what the Talmud states about the subject in Yevamot 69b. Until 40 days from conception, the fetus is merely water. It is not yet considered a living being. Now, it could not be any more direct than that to show that it is a denial of the moment of conception as being the starting point of life. And they just consider it to be some sort of amorphous blob, if you will, a liquid. So it is said that at that point, it becomes living or alive, but it does not have a soul or a spirit. Okay, so then they sort of clarify that at the 40-day mark. So that means for the next 240 days of pregnancy, all the way up to the moment of birth, the Talmud permits abortion for the well-being of the mother. And I will show you. This is in Oholot 7:6. So this is at the moment of delivering the baby. If a woman is in hard travail, one cuts up the child in her womb and brings it forth member by member, because her life comes before that of the child. But if the greater part, it's speaking about the head in this context, if the greater part has proceeded forth, in other words, what they're saying is, if you have more than half of the head extending from the uterus, from the womb, okay, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. So what are they getting at here? The rabbis taught that at that moment when you have the first opportunity to breathe air into your life, that is when God breathes his spirit and your soul, your nephesh, into your being. That is the moment when you become a human being, according to the rabbis. when the baby is now more than halfway out of the womb. And at that point in time, the law that allows for abortion, if it puts the woman's life at risk, can no longer be practiced. You have to then proceed with the birth, because as it says here, they're essentially equal in terms of value and worth. So this is the key to our understanding. This is the view then within Judaism of when we become human. Prior to that moment where you're coming out of the birth canal, you are considered not to be fully human. You are considered to be part of the woman's body. And thus it can be treated like any other part of the body, including its removal. So we need to recognize that this is the teachings of the rabbis. This is not from the Bible. The Bible never states this as being true. It is a complete assumption that has been made by men centuries after the Bible was written. Nevertheless, it carries great influence within the Jewish community because of the weight of the authority that the Talmudic rabbis assume for themselves. And these are the same ones who rejected the authority of Yeshua. And so they tend to hold points of view that will be the exact opposite of those who are Messianic in orientation or Christian. The rabbis base this view of a baby in the womb not being a nephesh, or a human being, on one particular passage in Scripture. They do have to use the Bible as the basis, but I want to show you how they are in error regarding this. And they use it as their justification for abortion. This verse is found in Exodus chapter 21, which is part of today's Parsha, or weekly reading of the Torah. And I find that to be rather ironic, that the Parsha lines up with the Roe versus Wade and the national sanctity of human life commemoration, because I believe that God is communicating something to us here. And I want to show you how this verse in Exodus 21, verse 22, is translated in the most widely used translation within the Jewish community by the Jewish Publication Society on this particular verse. And I'll put that up on the screen. And it reads, "When men fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible," that means the one who actually made the blow, as these guys are fighting and happens to hit this bystander or maybe a wife, "the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning." All right, so here are the words, right out of virtually all English translations of the Tanakh that are used within the Jewish community. And I'm very specifically identifying within that particular context of English translations. So based on these words, the argument is made in rabbinical Judaism and by the liberal side of Christianity that are jumping on the backs of this rabbinical tradition and adopting it for themselves. See, this is the key. And it goes like this. Because it describes a miscarriage, that means a fetus has died, right? Isn't that the normal way that we use the word miscarriage? And because this passage only requires monetary compensation and not capital punishment, it cannot be murder. This is the entire basis of their argument to support abortion. Thus, the fetus is treated as damaged property or body parts, not as independent human life. And then that falls under the category of the halakha, the legal portion of the Torah that determines what to do when property is damaged. This is the key verse that Judaism stands on regarding permitting abortion. And as I said, this is the verse now that liberal Christians are using to defend their pro-choice stand as well. So if somebody were to make that argument to you, how would you respond? What is it that is here that you could have a disagreement with based on those words? I don't think those words leave any room for disagreement. If that is what the actual Hebrew is saying, then I would have to agree with that particular argument. But are the English words accurate? That is the key. That is why we have to have a more precise understanding of the original Hebrew. And I want to point out several key errors in the translation into English. There are 3 errors in this translation. First, it does not refer to miscarriage. It refers to premature birth. The Hebrew word for miscarriage is shachal. It's not used here. It is used 2 chapters later in Exodus 23:26. So that tells me that Moses knows that word, and that if he wanted to convey the concept of a miscarriage, he would have used it here, but he did not. Instead, he used the word yasa, which means to go out. Okay? That's one of those idioms, one of the references in Scripture that describes normal birth, the delivery of a child from the womb. And we see that used many places in the Tanakh. But since this birth was induced by some form of physical contact, the passage here is dealing with a birth that is late enough in the pregnancy that the child actually survives, because it is not a miscarriage. The child survives and does not die. Now, that's the first error. It does not refer to miscarriage. Secondly, it does not refer to a fetus. It refers to a child. As I mentioned, miscarriage implies the death of a fetus. But here the subject is a yeled, which means a child. And it is conjugated to read her children. It's interesting when you read it that way. And I believe that that is simply a way of just saying that it's neither male nor female that is the point here. Any of her children. It's a child. It's not a fetus. Thirdly, it does not refer to other damage. See the implication there? It refers to no damage whatsoever. So what you got to do is you got to take that word other that's in there and remove it from the English, because it's not there in the Hebrew. And this is a very clever translation tool to imply that there is damage to the fetus. It's not there. I believe that these words were intentionally inserted. That word was intentionally inserted by the translators in order to defend their position that goes back to the rabbis, to justify what the rabbis have taught all along, because they do not want to put the rabbis in a negative light, because that breaks down the whole authority system of Judaism. See how things are intentionally done and oftentimes are manipulative. Get that word out. But my point here is that altogether the original language shows that this is about a premature birth in which the child lives, not miscarriage in which a fetus dies. Accordingly, I want to show you now an accurate translation of Exodus 21:22. I have looked at every single word in this verse, and I believe that the New American Standard captures it the most accurately of all. If you look at the Revised Standard Version, the one that is used in the more liberal side of Christianity today, their translation reflects the previous one. But the New American Standard says, if men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. Okay, So the point here is that the penalty that we see here is for the premature birth, not for damage. Okay, that's a completely separate category. It's for the premature birth. And so the husband determines, okay, this is what I want as, a fine for what you've done to bring this, chaos into my life. And then they would take that proposal to the judges, and they decide whether they will agree upon it or not. It's basically like a legal system today where people come to some sort of an agreement. But see, then as the passage continues, we're not going to take the time to do that today. It's in the Parsha, and we will actually study this in greater detail then. Then it goes into to say, if there is damage, then you go into the compensation that is according. So that if it is damage to the child or to the mother, in terms of something that will affect that person either for a period of time or for the rest of their life. And then there's a sliding scale that goes all the way from what is the cost of the life, let's say if the mother dies, or all the way down to a bruise. What is the value of a bruise? And so this is the foundational principle of Hebraic justice. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and so on, what they call the lex talionis. But you see, that's not part of this verse here. It's a separate issue. The last flaw in this verse to justify abortion has to do with the claim that since it does not call for capital punishment, the fetus cannot be a human. But you see, that ignores another principle of Hebraic justice. Capital punishment only applies if you intentionally kill the victim, or you intentionally strike somebody and it leads to their death. There is no provision for second-degree murder in terms of capital punishment in Judaism. There is the equivalent of manslaughter. Okay, so if you accidentally kill somebody, then you are liable, and the scripture goes into some ways of creating justice in that regard. So the point here is simply because they would say it doesn't call for capital punishment, even if it was true that this was a miscarriage, capital punishment would not apply because this is not intentional murder. This is somebody who's an innocent bystander who gets caught up in the fight and gets injured, and whether or not the death is there is not the issue. So they twist all of these things, and they ignore these fundamental Hebraic principles that are essential for our understanding. All this to say that when you consider the original language and you read the verse in context, Exodus 21, verse 22, cannot be used in any way to justify abortion. And since it is the linchpin, it is the foundation for the entire justification of allowing abortion within Judaism, and then within the liberal Christianity, you lose it. You lose the justification. In other words, there is no biblical justification for abortion. Zero. And we need to be clear on that. And we need not be intimidated by those who attempt to use the Bible in an invalid way. Well, what then does the Bible actually say about when life begins? That's what I really want to know. Here's what we're told in Genesis 1:27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. The word here translated as created is bara. It's the exact same word that's used in Genesis 1:1 to describe the way that God created the heavens and the earth. Exact same word. Well, that was the creation of the heavens and the earth was a total creation out of nothing. The heavens and the earth did not exist at all. And then when God exercised his will and his omnipotent power, they came into existence. And for those skeptics who are out there, the Big Bang Theory basically says the same thing. I've talked about that a number of times. So it is always a matter of faith. So in terms of the earth, it was not in its final form, which would be developed in the succeeding verses, as we just read on in Genesis chapter 1. But the identity was established at the very moment of creation. That is our parallel that we see with human beings. So when we consider the way that humanity came into the existence initially, it was the result of the same creative act of the will of God and his omnipotence. And we see evidence of a similar creative act when it comes to subsequent human beings after Adam and Eve. What happens in the womb is a miracle. It's the almighty God of the universe creating someone that didn't exist before. Every person has a unique genetic code in every cell of our body. It's an amazing thing. And it goes all the way back to that very first fertilized egg. It becomes a zygote. From that moment on, every cell has every bit of genetic code that is unique to that individual and that will never be replicated. There will never be another person exactly like that. Even among twins, there's mutations and variations that will occur there as well. But the point is that before conception, neither the sperm nor the egg had the entire genetic code. It is only when they become fused together. And it is then present in every moment from that conception to the birth until the final days of a person's life. And that code is distinct from the code of the mother. Okay, see the connection there? It's not part of the mother. So here we see the creation of a being that was not in existence prior to conception. And we see that it is not part of the mother. They are unique entities. The second thing that we notice about that verse is that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And when you study the underlying Hebraic meaning behind those terms, we can see that they refer to self-awareness and personhood. That means that unlike animals, we can be aware of our place in the universe and what the implications are of life and death and eternity. We alone can have that understanding. That's part of the image of God. And the likeness of God has to do with personhood. That we are unique, that we can relate to one another and we can relate to God. So the key to our understanding is that those are descriptive terms of how every unique human being receives at the moment of creation. From that very moment onward, we bear the image and likeness of God. And then it becomes developed in a process over time, continuing long after birth. Some of us are still working on our image and likeness of God and truly reflecting that. But you see, the image and likeness have always been there from the very beginning, which is conception. So then when we go on and we consider God's words in Genesis 9:6, we see how profound the implications of the image and likeness are. For we read, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man." See, this prohibition against the shedding of blood applies to all people, all humans who bear the image and likeness of God. And who bears the image and likeness of God? Is it only us who are walking on this earth? No. It's those who were created with it from the very beginning, at that very moment, when the sperm and the egg came together. You see, this speaks profoundly to what actually occurs then in the act of abortion. For when that person is aborted from the womb, you're shedding man's blood. You're damaging the image of God that is inherent in that person. So this prohibition against the shedding of blood applies to all people who bear the image of God, including the babies in the womb. Now, in other places in God's word, Adonai is very clear about addressing the personal nature of unborn humans. For example, when he called Jeremiah to be a prophet, he said, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations." The reason why Adonai says this to Jeremiah is that Jeremiah is a young guy, and all of a sudden he's getting this calling to be the prophet to the nation of Israel or Judah. And he's kind of like, me? Nah, not me. And God is saying, no. This has been part of the plan from the very beginning. Even before they're being formed in the womb, which goes back, what is before that? It goes back to the moment when he is created in the womb. He already consecrated him. It means he set him apart for this particular purpose. Well, he's revealing his intimate connection here to someone who bore the image and likeness of God. Catch that? This is the key. If you have the image and likeness of God, you can have a relationship. You have a unique person, and you can have a relationship with others, and you can have a relationship with God. Amen. And so because Jeremiah bore that image and likeness, he was already establishing the relationship with him while he was in the womb. And notice how God is behind the creative act itself. And so this would include the creation of our soul, not just our bodies. He's getting at the person. And that is where the soul comes in. It is our soul that makes us persons, that makes us distinct from animals. Here's what King David said. He made a very similar declaration in Psalm 139. "Adonai, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down, and are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, Adonai, you know it all." So here we have a description of the way that God knows everything from the very beginning. It's essentially just a declaration about the omniscience of God, beginning with the very thoughts in our minds. So don't think that you can get away with God in your thoughts. So based on this all-knowing nature of God, later on, then it shifts from the mind to the body. And he knows everything about every cell in our bodies. It says in verse 13, "For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb." This is such a powerful description of the way that during a woman's pregnancy, the child's body is being knitted together, woven together. The cardiovascular system and all the internal organs, the musculature and the skeletal systems, our immune system, our skin that enables us to touch and to feel, our eyes to see, our ears to hear, our nose to smell, our mouth to speak and to breathe, and a brain to decide what to do with all these things. They are all woven together in a way that is ordained by God. It's not evolution. It's not chance. This is God at work. And he goes on to say in verse 14, "I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." Are you catching this now? Here's the soul. Here's the nephesh. It's in the womb. Not, when the baby sticks its head out and breathes for the first time, and somehow the breath comes in and then it becomes a soul. It's right here in the womb. You see, those who advocate for abortion will not ever acknowledge this verse. Never. The root of the word translated as fearfully is yareh. And it's a word that is used in Scripture to convey reverence and respect, often directed towards God here, but he's in this particular case, it's more of a passive reflection, reflecting on the fearful way that God has made him, in this case David, but it applies to all of us. When we fear God, it is not just being afraid of what he can do to us, but to demonstrate that we revere him and we respect him and everything that he has said, that we will honor that. That's what it means to fear God in many respects. So it is for human beings while in their mother's womb. We need a healthy fear about the harm that could come upon someone who is so vulnerable at that moment of their existence as a person. We need to revere the amazing creative work of God and the incredible nature of life from its earliest moments all the way to that last one. We need to respect what God has declared about preserving and protecting life, especially the innocent. And what greater state of innocence can there be than for a living soul that has not even had yet an opportunity to sin? Think about that. That is innocence. Above all, we need to fear, revere, and respect the one who is the very creator of life. Because when we cast life aside in such a cavalier manner, it can occur in a lot of different ways. It could be abortion. It could be, murdering somebody. We are actually rejecting and offending the creator of life, the sovereign God of the universe, when we treat life in such a way. The word translated as wonderfully is pala, which means to distinguish, to make distinct. That means that every one of us is unique. David is unique in that regard, as we all are. There will never be another you. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not, but tragically, in the United States since 1973, there are 62 million uniquely created human beings that were never given an opportunity to give thanks to God for their lives. I am convinced that we have reached such a time in our history that our nation, where we have largely lost what it means to fear, revere, and respect God, and to acknowledge his divine authority over our lives. It's slipping away. We no longer consider life to be sanctified and made holy by him. We, as a nation, have exalted convenience over obedience. We have lost sight of how precious life is. Every breath that we are given, and even when we rely upon our mother to provide us with our oxygen while in the womb. We are foolish to think that we are exempt from consequences because of the choices that we make as a nation and as individuals. But that does not mean that it has to be so. There is no doubt that God will always respond favorably to anyone, any person, any nation that turns from its evil ways back to him.
Amen. Amen.
He says that many places in his word, 2 Chronicles 7 and so on. Perhaps we can learn from another time in our nation's history when we were headed in one particular direction and we turned from that evil back in the direction of righteousness. In the year 1857, the United States Supreme Court ruled in what is called the Dred Scott decision. The people of black descent could not be citizens of the United States, just in the same way that whites are. And they were shamefully considered, according to that decision, to be no different than any other form of property. Well, not everybody agreed with that, and that led to the Civil War. 4 years later, that began. And eventually, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation came about in 1863. And that was followed by the 13th Amendment 2 years after that outlawed slavery. And for all intents and purposes, it formalized what was already true, that blacks are human beings like anyone else. Well, now as we think back on that, many people think about that and said, how could we have gotten this so wrong prior to that point in time? It seems ludicrous that there would have to be an Emancipation Proclamation and a 13th Amendment. But you see, in the early days of our nation, the thinking was very different. And I cannot help but see the parallels to our nation's present situation when it comes to abortion. Unborn children are treated no different than blacks were prior to freedom. They were property. Unborn children are considered to be property of the mother and are not considered to be human beings by a great proportion of our nation. But that does not make it right. My prayer is that we as a nation will see the error of our ways and will turn from them just in the same way that we turned from slavery. As we have seen, science, reasoning, and God's holy message to all people combine to demonstrate that human life begins at conception. The Bible does not have a different word for a child in the womb like a fetus. It's always a person. It's always a child. It's always a baby. If I might quote another notable theological work entitled Horton Hears a Who by Dr. Seuss, a person's a person, no matter how small. In the end, our understanding of when life begins is a matter of faith for everyone, both pro-choice and pro-life alike. It's a matter of faith. But according to the biblical definition of faith, in Romans 11:1, it is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We have substantial evidence that life begins at conception. And it is a matter of the handiwork of the Creator that we cannot see. We cannot see God at work in this way. But we have evidence that that is so. After all, He is the one who created the universe out of nothing. Likewise, He creates human beings with a soul that did not exist prior to conception. And He also transforms human beings into new creatures spiritually when we believe in Yeshua, as Paul describes in 2 Corinthians 5:17. In every way, Adonai is the only giver of life. Can you agree with the depth of evidence that testifies about the way that God brings life both physically and spiritually to those who bear His image and likeness? If so, you are a person of true faith because you have considered the evidence, unlike those who have a faith that really isn't true because they have not done the same. My hope is that we can stand together on this truth that others deny or that they maybe have never considered, that life begins at conception. May God give us the great wisdom and a powerful message to this world that is out there, that needs to change its direction in so many ways.